You just cannot tell me that having an intellectual relationship with ancestors, with thinkers who are no longer with us, having a particular kind of curiosity about historical moments or historical circumstances, how the past informs the present, and allowing your intellectualism to wade in those waters is not a form of time traveling. And I just think it is. Welcome, everyone. It is your host, Iman. And today I'm feeling particularly grounded because I got to spend some time alone. So I guess I'm finding grounding in alone time. In this past week, I had two of my best friends get married, and then I had a family vacation for the week. I've spent the past 7 to 10 days surrounded by friends, surrounded by family, surrounded by my loved ones. And that has been very energizing. That has been very fun. And that has been very restorative. But it also put into sharp focus that I am someone who increasingly needs a lot more alone time than I anticipated. For those of you who know me in real life or perhaps from other things, you know that I'm an identical twin. So I always joke that learning to be an individual was something that I actually had to learn, that I didn't always have a very strong sense of it. And growing up, I grew up in a house with 7 people. So I used to think all the time, why do people want to be alone? That sounds like the scariest thing. My inner child just laughs thinking about how much towards the end I was yearning just to be back in my apartment. I missed kind of my morning routine. I missed just having a moment of just waking up in the morning, not having anybody there, getting to hear my own thoughts, getting to do my own thing. I took myself out to one of my favorite diners around here to breakfast, and I went on a beautiful, lovely walk. Spent the day writing. Now I'm recording this. So I also feel like when I am alone, I get the chance to do some of my best intellectual work. But often when I am around other people, it feels like a true break from work, because there's something about living an intellectual life and being in the knowledge economy where when you have a lot of free time, for me personally, in the background, my mind is always wandering to research, to thinking about public humanities in this project, thinking about how I'm going to grow this, thinking about an article that I'm writing, thinking about another that I'm drafting, thinking about another that I have to revise. And so your mind just gets focused on work. Or I also start thinking about these like big lofty concepts and all of these things. So it's actually funny that when I am around people, I actually feel like I have a true break from work versus like when I am in solitude and when I am in my alone time, that is when I'm just at my intellectual best. And so it felt very fitting to spend the day just taking myself out to breakfast by myself. I realized living by myself that going out to eat and doing things alone is something that I really truly enjoy. I also feel like it's a skill that everybody should do. I feel like everybody should go to dinner by themselves. Everybody should go take themselves on dates and do these small things that I used to think was absolutely terrifying. But now I literally feel spiritually and intellectually malnourished when I do not do those things for myself. And I also find that when I am by myself, I do my best thinking about the past. As you all know, I'm an intellectual historian, primarily focused on the 20th century. So I spend a lot of time thinking about folks and thinking with folks who were at the height of their careers 80 years ago, 100 years ago, 60 years ago. And so I find that when I'm alone, I am my best time traveling self, which is a perfect segue, as always, to our grounding question of the day, which is how to develop a relationship with the past. And I thought, putting on my UK slang in a cheeky way, perhaps the grounding question really is how to time travel, because I think developing a relationship with the past is actually how one time travels. But I'm still always navigating between this spiritual space and this intellectual space. But no one is ever going to not tell me that being someone who thinks not just about the past and with people who are no longer here, but thinks with them is not a form of time traveling. Of course, we have the modern day sci-fi understanding of time traveling, meaning going back in the past, but you just cannot tell me that having an intellectual relationship with ancestors, with thinkers who are no longer with us, having a particular kind of curiosity about historical moments or historical circumstances, how the past informs the present, and allowing your intellectualism to wade in those waters is not a form of time traveling. And I just think it is. And so it got me thinking about today about how when I'm alone, I feel like I do my best time traveling. I do my best thinking with as Ahmad Green Hayes calls them, archival ancestors. I do my best thinking with the theories and the concepts that I'm writing about, that I'm trying to pull apart. I'm this summer doing a bunch of archival work, and that has been really fun. It's the reason why I am in New York this summer. And I found myself thinking, you want to know what? I think that academics could write an amazing guide on how to time travel from a very practical standpoint. And so, how do you develop a relationship to the past? How do you intellectually time travel? And there are, of course, some more obvious answers, right? That includes, very importantly, talking to elders. That includes developing an interest and curiosity about past historical moments and events and how they impact the present. And that can also look like immersing yourself in the life and the career and the thinking of a particular thinker, of somebody in the past, creating, as I mentioned, as Ahmad Green Hayes calls them, archival ancestors out of someone. I think a perfect example of this is how folks create archival ancestors out of people like Audre Lorde, out of people like Malcolm X, out of people like Queen Mother Audley Moore, and many others. But in addition to all of those ways, I have found that I do my best time traveling when I can identify a question that I am extremely interested in, and a question that is one of those big, lofty ones. And then I start going and asking people, thinkers, contexts of the past, what their answer to that question might be. And then I go a step further by thinking about how that answer to that question in conversation with those thinkers in the past challenges a pre-existing concept, something that we take for granted, a sense of common sense notions of how the world is. And so I want to meditate on that last point today, because I think for me, if I had to build a time traveling machine, it would actually be identifying a question that I am super invested in, and then thinking about how the answer to that question challenges the status quo, challenges a particular notion of common sense, and really pushes my thinking forward. And is a question that I recognize there's not just a single answer to that. There's always going to be so many answers to it. Now that seems a little abstract, but I promise I'm going to ground us in something that feels a little bit more concrete. So I take, for example, my dissertation research and the kind of questions that motivated my thinking with 20th century Black Muslim women. Now, I say questions because the beautiful thing about having a question that you are committed to finding an answer to is that bigger question, or even that smaller question, is going to start generating a bunch of other ones, a bunch of related ones. For example, I would say that at the most broadest level, my intellectualism has always been deeply motivated by a desire to figure out answer to the questions of how do people know what they know? How do people know the thing that they know for certain? How do people know what one thing is? And so I've been particularly interested in how do Black women come to know what religion is? How do Black women come to know what Islam is? And so I had that question, and I've spent years thinking about it, a decade, one would say, thinking about it. A part of being able to articulate that question had to do with the fact that just a part of applying to grad school is being really clear on the kinds of questions that drive your research. So I was forced to make sure that the questions that I'm interested in were actually articulated, both to me and that I could articulate them to other people. But having the practice of being able to articulate the kinds of questions in the back of your head that motivate you, that you tend to ponder on when your mind goes elsewhere, is also a question that is reaching for you. And we talked about that in a previous episode when we think about channeling. And so, for example, I had no idea that the Roman Empire is something that I guess a lot of men spend a lot of time thinking about. There was like this thing going around the internet where it's like, go up to a man, presumably a straight man, I'm also assuming a presumably white man, and ask them how often they think about the Roman Empire, and they would say every day. So I bring that up because that's actually really useful of trying to think about what is your Roman Empire? What is something that you're going to be able to think about all day? And then once you identify that question, then start going to past people, past thinkers, histories, even picking up actual publications of people in the past and asking that question. So then when I started my dissertation and I thought, okay, how do Black women come to know what Islam is? I went and I started researching books and researching histories and researching scholars who also thought along similar lines. And when I did that, I realized that there were patterns in the kinds of answers. I realized that a lot of folks answered the question of how do Black women come to know Islam through domestic life, through marriage, through motherhood, through dress and aesthetics, through mosques and particular religious organizations, through things like religious texts and developing theologies. It started coming into frame that there was a particular answer to the question of how do Black women come to know Islam? Oh, also through external religious authorities. And I thought, okay, yes, those are all answers to that question. Those are all answers that scholars are giving me. But I then at the same time was also going to primary sources. I was going into the writings by actual Black Muslim women in the 20th century, people like Safia Bukhari, people like Betty Shabazz, and thinking with them. And I was seeing that they came to know Islam through things outside of marriage, outside of their domestic lives, outside of what religious leaders told them, outside of their religious communities. And I started realizing that they also come to know Islam through particular forms of embodied knowledge that are both about lived experience, because that was another one that came up, but also included things like intuition and channeling and one-on-one conspiratorial relationships to the divine. And so again, I started thinking with the past, and I had spent almost 6 years thinking with that question, thinking with those answers. My mind was able to wander in what I would call time travel to thinking with them and thinking with the past, thinking about how they came to know Islam differently. And that all generated from me being able to articulate, what is my Roman Empire? My Roman Empire was, how do Black women come to know what religion is? How do Black women come to know what spirituality is? How do Black women develop habits of the mind that allow them to know and see the religious and the spiritual in a world that is so structured and predetermined by secularism? What can they teach me as a Black woman in this world? And that was a question, that was my rocket ship, that was my time traveling machine that allowed me to think with them. And to think with the people of the past, not just about history and about the past and about them, but think with them. Think about what they are trying to teach me in this moment as a Black woman, as a Black Muslim woman, as a Black woman who's interested in what the term religion and spirituality means in the context of modernity, in the context of our contemporary circumstances, in the context of an anti-Black world. So again, time traveling and developing a relationship with the past looks like many things, but I find it is the most generative when I have a question that I am able to articulate that I want an answer to, and I go to people of the past to figure out how they would answer that question. Now, what I also do, you want to take it to a step further and really get yourself propelling, is think about how the answer to that question also challenges a really common sense notion that we take for granted as just being true or natural. And so for me, the kind of common sense thing that I felt that thinking about Black women's embodied knowledge and how they come to know Islam through it, to me, that unsettled both how people think about self-determination, how Black women have thought about what it means to determine for themselves their own relationships to religion, to authority, to their everyday lives. Because frequently there's this idea that Black self-determination and histories of Black self-determination, which is the philosophy that Black folks should be able to determine for themselves the relationship to both the state, but also the relationship to their everyday lives, to power, to resources, to materiality, is often one that is a male-centered history, is also one that focuses on the religion of it all being extremely focused on mosques and texts and these more normative, I would say, capital big R religion when we think about religion. And so it really unsettled for me that, oh no, people come to know Islam and what Islam is through these embodied modes of knowing, not just what the sheikh or the imam says, or the minister, not just what they read in the Quran, not just what they hear at the mosque, not just reflected in how they dress. There's also these other embodied modes of knowing that are equally as important to their articulation and their understanding of what Islam is. And that is a kind of academic mode of thinking that anyone will tell you that once you're able to identify what the answer to that question is and how that answer unsettles common understandings, then you got a big, they call that an intervention in academia. And that to me feels like jet fuel. That to me feels like, oh my gosh, I've reached an answer. Not a singular answer, because I was never in search of just one answer, but an intervention. And to me, an intervention, an unsettling of the common sense, is as close as you come to feeling satiated as if there was only one answer to a question. I hope that makes sense and isn't too lofty and philosophical. But also in general, what I think is so important about developing a relationship to the past and not just thinking about certain thinkers, but thinking with them, is that it also unsettles a real key component of how we think about secularism. As Talal Asad writes, secularism is not just the absence of religion. We talk a lot on this podcast, and we're going to keep talking a lot about this, about how secularism in America isn't just the idea of the separation between church and state. It's just not the idea of kind of an absence of religion. Secularism comes to determine what is good religion, what is bad religion, what is appropriate in the public sphere, what should not be in the public sphere. But another, as Talal Asad also argues, really important part of secular thinking is the idea that progress moves from past to present, or that a history of past to present is defined by progress, meaning that we are told that where we are right now in this world, technology and all, thinking and all, knowledge and all, is better, is more advanced, is more progressive than anything we've had in the past. And I've always felt that is just feels so insulting, because it almost assumes that right now we are smarter in the present than our ancestors were in the past. We're taught through history, through this idea that democracy and freedom have been reached in this moment, and that things like slavery and anti-Blackness are not present. But it's this fundamental kind of logic within our society, is the idea that we are smarter in this present moment than our ancestors were in the past. And that creates a really messed up relationship to the past. It makes us think that the past is not worthy of engaging with, that there's always going to be better answers in the present. And as somebody who spends so much time reading with people who were writing at the end of the 19th century, who were writing all across the 20th century, I can 100% guarantee you what you find and what you hear is actually more advanced, more radical, more ingenious than things that we often come across today. And that their description of reality is realities that we experience today. So that is also challenging this idea that progress belongs to the present, but also that the past is not something worthy to engage with because we've already progressed past it. So that might seem really obvious, but I think it's really worth interrogating for yourself of how this assumption that the present is the best and that the past is worse, or that the people before us were not as smart, they were not as equipped, they were not as innovative, how that also prevents us from really thinking with and time traveling, prevents us from turning to the past for answers for our most pressing questions in the present. You really have to challenge that secular mindset that is ingrained in us in order to, again, get some fuel for that rocket propulsion into the past. And maybe it's a little corny that I keep using time traveling metaphors, but I'm just going to stick with it. So again, our question was, how do you develop a relationship to the past? AKA, how do you time travel? And we talked about how you can talk to elders, you can develop a real keen interest in a particular kind of historical moment or time period, or you can immerse yourself to a particular kind of thinker. But I also think there's a really important fourth option, which is being able to identify what is your Roman Empire? What is the kind of big, lofty question that you can spend forever thinking about, or that your mind wanders to, and start not just thinking about the past, but thinking with people of the past and the kinds of answers they might provide to that question. And then going a step further and thinking about how the answers that you find from the past challenge a common sense notion that you have in the present. That is academic par excellence, in my opinion. You will find that your thoughts start to wander with different people. You start to think about how different kinds of concepts that you take for granted now might have really functioned and meant totally different things in the past. But also important to that, and something that I feel like I want to just keep reiterating, is that doing that thinking with folks of the past is also a practice. It is something you have to commit to, not daily, but just for a long time, consistently. It takes a lot of reading. It takes a lot of alone time, a lot of meandering and wandering through your own thoughts, a lot of stumbling upon things that you didn't know were there. In my experience, once I go searching for answers to a question in one place, the answers that I was really looking for always come from other places. But again, it's a practice. I've been thinking about this one question for 10 years. I thought about it for 10 years before I was able to write a dissertation on it. And so it's something that also cultivates across a long period of time. And I think there can often feel like there's a rush to having certain answers, a rush to figuring things out, but knowing that people have dedicated their entire lives to the question of, how do Black women come to know what they know? That is, how do people come to know what they know? That is something that people have been thinking about for as long as human existence has happened, right? We are conscious of our consciousness. So I know I'm not going to find the exact answer, but I'm going to keep coming across answers that motivate me. So again, it's also a practice. And I find that by developing a question that you are interested in and thinking with people of the past, thinking about how it unsettles common misunderstandings is how you create a long-term practice that exists in both the front of your mind and the back of the mind, so that when you have time, when you wander, when you have time to commit to it, when you have time to yourself, you also start to move in those spaces. So that is what I am leaving with you all today. I'm leaving here feeling grounded in the fact that sometimes it actually doesn't matter how much time you put into something. It's the very fact that you showed up and actually put the time into it. So like I said, I've been super busy, but this is week 17 of Grounded, and I am committed to never missing a week. And even if it's just a short episode like this, even though last week we did have a longer episode, I still showed up. I still gave an answer to a question that was pondering and a thought that was circulating in my head. And it's also just a single moment in the conversation. As I say, we're here every week and we're going to keep talking about these things. So as always, you can find me on social media at IMANABDK, Iman ABDK, on YouTube, on Instagram, on TikTok. Please DM me a question that you want me to answer. Last week, we had an awesome question by Yasmin, and I love getting listener questions because it helps me feel like this is a conversation between both you and I. And if you really want to do something for me, please recommend the show to a friend, spread the word. And so I will see you guys here next week. Happy Monday. Bye-bye.